such a wonderful turnout. And this honestly illustrates exactly why we need to build. And in our proposed new building, which is a 60 by 100 foot building, we do have a projection room or a meeting room that we don't plan to put cabinets in and everything, but to leave it for programs like this, and then the walls will be used to display local artists or local pictures or that kind of thing. So this is wonderful. We'll take several pictures, and that will prove to everybody that we do need a place to gather. With that said, you're in for a treat tonight. I could think of lots of descriptions for you.
All good, all good.
Thanks, I think.
He said most of the people in here is relatives, so we probably already know.
You might be able to add to my list,
Yeah.
right? But the ones I want to use tonight is I want to use the description of a historian. And not only is he a historian, but he does a tremendous amount of research and visiting of the places that he's going to talk about. So he's well versed in the history that he's going to present to you. So that's one description I want to use of Donn. The other is I want to use that he is a storyteller. You know, a lot of us have a lot of information in our heads, or we think we do, but we don't know how to tell it. And Donn has the ability to tell that in an entertaining, fun way.
Baffle him with bullshit.
Those are his words. Yes, I know.
Don't let the truth get in the way of a good story.
And the third description I want to use of Donn is he is a volunteer. He is here on his own time, his own dime tonight to present and share with us in our community. So with that, Donn, I'm going to turn it over to you.
You should talk a little longer, it's still rebooting. Thank you, Debbie. When Debbie asked me about doing a second presentation this summer besides the one I already did, I said, sure, and she says, well, what is it going to be about? And I kind of went, well, right now I'm really fascinated by some really Kansas histories with famous people and how a lot of them tied into our local community. And she says, that's fine. And so like a week ago, I'm at the post office and she goes, you need to give me a description for your presentation next week. And I went, what presentation? and so that's what it's about. And as I put it together, it just got funner and funner. So you got to put up with my rambling, but I'm kind of happy how it come out. So I haven't given it to anybody else yet, so you're my guinea pigs. Come on, boot up, boot up. And so the first couple of people I want to talk about doesn't really flow into the main part of the presentation, but they're the ones that I had left over from the last time when it got too long. I think we went 2.5 hours that time. So I do want to talk about them a little bit. So we'll catch them and then we'll get into the real rambling. Come on, boot up, boot up, boot up.
Donn,
Yeah.
nice. Increase your volume just a little bit.
Okay, I'll try. Very seldom do people have to tell me to be quiet or to speak up. So the first couple of slides, if it ever gets up, is kind of the first white people through this area was Thomas Shea expedition of 1819. And so he came up the Missouri River and sent a party up the Kansas River to explore it, especially the rumor of a large Kansa village. And so they found that Kansa village about a mile west or east of the Blue River mouth into the Kansas River, where present Manhattan is. And at that time, the Blue River would have been east of Walmart, west of Walmart. That channel there, that was the channel of the river at that time. And so the village would have been in the sale barn area, Menards in there somewhere. And, but it was 120 lodges, so there was probably 3,000 or 4,000 people living in that Konza village. And so they spent a night there, and then they headed north from Manhattan up the Blue River, and they got about 7 miles north of Manhattan, and some Pawnees came upon them and took their horses and took all their possessions and took all their clothes and embarrassed them and left them there. And so they spent the night there in the cold, naked, up north of Manhattan. So the next day they went back to the Konza Indian village, and that night the Konza did a dog dance for them, and they depicted that in a drawing. And so I have those slides if it ever boots up. And so I'm talking here. Come on. There we go. Anyhow, that's my first slides, and I can be done with them. So then anyhow, from the Konza village, they headed northeast to meet up with the long keelboat on the Missouri River. They went right through this area to get back to the Missouri and bypass the Pawnee Indians. So, come on, baby. I think we're finally there. We're online. Hot dang. Yeah. This is embarrassing.
Perfectly understandable. Been there, done that.
Yeah.
Actually, not even that complicated, and it
No.
happens. There we
Okay, here we go, finally. So that was a long expedition. I said the Shea expedition, but it was Shea that he sent up the river. That's a drawing of the Konza villages down by Manhattan. And the next day, that was the Chief White Plume. They went up north, got embarrassed by the Pawnee, went back and did the dog dance. That's the drawing of the 1819 dog dance where Manhattan's at now. I just think that's pretty cool, and gives you a feel for what life was here then. So the Pawnees that took them came from the Pawnee Indian village up west of Belleville. And there's a wonderful museum up there, and the grounds of the museum encompass about that much of the old village site. And that wouldn't even be there. They were plowing it up to farm it, and a woman up there at Cortland actually laid down in the dead furrow to stop them from plowing, and that's what preserved what's left of that Republican village. State of Kansas, Tom Whitty was a state archaeologist. They just did a marvelous job. They picked a likely lodge site, built the museum, and then excavated the site inside. So when you go in to tour that museum, you're looking at an archaeological excavation. It's just superbly done. So that monument is actually a monument to Zebulon Pike's visiting of that village in 1806. The problem is he never visited that village in 1806. And Kansas knows it, Nebraska knows it, but Kansas won't take the marker down. That's an aerial view. You can see all the outlines of the lodges and that what's left. And the defensive wall around it, and it's right on the Republican River there. And so the reason I say he was never there was there was another Pawnee village. They moved sites. The illness would break out when they got it cropped out, that kind of thing. Although the Pawnee, the buffalo hunts all the way down to the Arkansas, but they actually had there were about 4,000 living in that village, and they, at the time when Zebulon Pike visited, they were up by Guide Rock, Nebraska, 30 miles upriver. And so I'm sure that that's when he visited, and the professionals are too, but I mean, I was finding that spot, and it was hard to find because they're farming all of it in Nebraska. You can't find any of the original lodge yet. But in 1806, when Zebulon Pike and his 16 men with him rode up to that camp, 300 mounted warriors came out to meet him, and there was a Spanish flag flying over the village. And so that first night, they didn't know if they were going to be attacked or not. And so they went across the Republican River, and on the bluffs looking out over the Republican River, they dug rifle pits to defend themselves if they needed to. And so when I found that site and I got to thinking about it, I wonder if those rifle pits are still there. That's prairie over there. And I got around the river and went back in there and started walking through the pastures, and there's the rifle pits. They're still there out in the middle of the pasture. You know, you could argue that the bulls did it or whatever, but to me, they were out on each peak looking out where the village would have been. To me, they were defensive dug pits, and so they're still there. And so my favorite Old West character is Jedediah Smith, and that's why I said I had to talk about a couple of these old ones. So this guy was fascinating. His dad went broke farming, then he went broke with a sawmill. He was 20 years old and had to go find work to help take care of the farm, and so he goes to St. Louis, and the only work he can find is to sign on as a trapper for William Sublette. And so he signed on to be a mountain man fur trapper, fresh from the farm. And so the first expedition, they're going up the Missouri River, and this was 1821, and they get up to the Mandan village site where North Dakota is now, Mandan, North Dakota now, and they spent the night there, and he stayed on the boat because they all wanted to stop there because the Mandans had a reputation for sharing their wives. And so all the rest of them went into the town, and in the middle of the night, all at once on a given signal, they massacred everybody else. And so then they tried to get him on the boat, and him and one other guy that got back to the boat, got it cut loose and went back downstream. And so they go back and they come up and they finally meet up with another party of Sublette's trappers heading north. And they're about across South Dakota now, and they decided it wasn't safe to go up past the abandoned village, so they take out on horseback going across country. And so they get west of the Black Hills now in eastern Wyoming, and Zebulon Pike is actually leading the party by then, and he's this 1-year-old kid that's never been off the farm, and very religious his whole life, what was left of it. But they were going through a bunch of young willows, and they couldn't ride their horses, so they were leading their horses through the willows, and all at once a grizzly bear rears up in front of him, and it attacks him, and it rips the whole top of his skull off, rips his ear off, broke his bowie knife, and broke his ribs underneath it. And so they finally get that bear off of him, and he's sitting there bleeding. They don't know what to do with him, and he tells one of the other trappers to go get a sewing kit out of his saddlebag and sew his ear back on and sew his scalp back on. And they did, and 2 weeks later he's riding a horse and leading them. And that's why he always wore his hair long after that, because one ear didn't look right anymore. So anyhow, this one guy, look at all those red lines. He hunting for beaver. He was the first eastern United States white person to travel to western Spaniard coast, arrested as a spy, thrown in prison, him and his men. They get released from prison and instructed to go back home. Instead, he heads north. He's the first white explorer to explore the white coast, the west coast. Gets up to the French settlements up by Oregon at the mouth of the Columbia. This back party gets attacked again, and all but 3 of them get wiped out. But the fort they get to the fort, the fort comes back and makes them give them back the pelts and the stuff they stole from them and that kind of stuff. And so these 4 guys, there were 4 of them that survived. So they head back to get back to civilization, and they hit the Great Desert. And so they buried the pelts that they had collected through all that time, instructed 2 guys to wait there until they got back, and him and another guy took off across the desert. And the other guy finally couldn't go any farther, and so he buried him in the sand with his head under a bush for shade, and he went on and found water and came back and rescued the guy, and they went on and made it back to civilization. And the next year he worked his way back around to them 2 guys, and they were still waiting on him, and they got the pelts and they made it back again. And so in 1825 and 26, he came right through here exploring, and he was hunting for a way to get wagons to the Continental Divide. And so he figured out that it could be done, and this is what became the Oregon Trail. And so 1825-26, this is what he found. And so anyhow, the reason they did that was they had a real mess with the trappers, because every winter they'd trap all winter, and then in the summer they'd have to go all the way back to St. Louis to bring the pelts back and restock to go back for another year of trapping. And they didn't work real well in society in St. Louis, and it wasted a lot of time. And so by figuring that out, after that, William Sublette would send wagons to the Continental Divide with supplies for another year and haul back the pelts that they gathered. And so the trappers could stay in the mountains and everybody was happy. And so that's what evolved into the Green Mountain Rendezvous, the Mountain Man Rendezvous. That was a real deal. It'd last 2 months long. Indians would come in, games, competition. That's where they brought the supplies and booze for another year and hauled back the pelts. And so it'd vary around the area. But that's all because Jedediah Smith went through here. So anyhow, and by 1831 he had survived like 4 different massacres of his men. And he decided that he wasn't going to last much longer. He had become very wealthy, buying into the partnership with Sublette. And they actually had to have government contracts in to have the rights to go to the mountains and trap from the government. Blah, blah, blah. But anyhow, he sold his shares out for a fortune and then invested in a train to go to Santa Fe on the Santa Fe Trail, and in 1831. And so they got as far as the Dodge City area, and they took the dry route instead of the wetter route, and they were dying of thirst. They couldn't find water. And so one day he sent his brother and another guy out a different direction to find water, and he went a different direction, and he never came back. And so the party eventually found water, found their way to St. Louis, and he's walking down the boardwalk in St. Louis, and he sees his brother Jedediah's guns in a store there for sale. So he goes in and buys them, and the story that came with them was there was a batch of Comanches on the Cimarron River, and a white man come riding up, and his horse was drinking out of the river. They had laid in ambush, and they surrounded him, and he kept them at bay with his guns until they finally got the horse to rear up, and then they took him. And he still killed 2 of the men when they did that. And so that was the story that came with that. And so I got done with one of my job trips out in western Kansas. I had a day to drive home, and I had Jedediah's book in my car with me, and I go, I wonder if I can find where he was ambushed, because it gave really good description of it in the book. And so I started driving the Cimarron River back and forth until I finally figure out it's over this hill by southwest of Setanta. And anyhow, it's back in a pasture over a hill, and the nearest thing I could see people was a feedlot, so I pull into that feedlot and I try and find somebody to talk to me, and nobody spoke English, and they kept pointing up at the scale house. So I went up to the scale house, and there was a cowboy in there, and I go, "Are you the owner?" And he goes, "Well, that depends on what do you want." And I said, "Well, I'm Donn Teske, and I'm just farting around, and I'm trying to find where Jedediah Smith got killed, and I think it's over the hill there." And he looked at me, and he looked at me, and he goes, "We didn't have anything to do with it." and I go, no, this happened in 1831, you know. And he goes, "Well, I know whose place it is. They won't mind. You can go do it." And so I drive over that hill, and I find where that spring was down in there. And it was a surreal feeling to think that somewhere in the sand around there, Jedediah's bones were laying within a stone's throw, you know. It was kind of surreal. And he's such a figure in American history that nobody's ever heard of. So Louis View, I'm not going to talk much about, just that he's a local figure. He's buried down here, got filthy rich, charging Oregon Trail travelers to cross his bridge. Raised a passel of kids with a passel family. Jim Thorpe's his grandson. Louisville is named after him. Bellevue is named after him. Word had it that he was so unorganized that, and he owned the whole Kaw River Valley down there, and he was so unorganized that when he died, they just had shoeboxes and shoeboxes full of deeds. It took them years to figure it all out. Half Potawatomi, represented the Potawatomi tribe several times in D.C., from Wisconsin. John Fremont, 1 minute on him. So John Fremont's father-in-law was the most powerful politician in the country, Thomas Hart Benton from Missouri, senator. And he wanted his son-in-law to be president of the United States. So all at once he starts out doing all these expeditions and exploratory expeditions. And then his wife would write books about it to make him famous. And so 1842, he came through here. And so Kit Carson was his guide. They had to spend a good part of the winter at Uniontown, south of Rossville, on the south side of the river, because of cholera, and they got sick, and that town was burnt several times because of cholera. There's mass Indian graves there. But anyhow, then when they could travel again, they crossed the river, then come up to the mouth of the Vermilion, and they found a burnt out Kansa village at the mouth of the Vermilion, which would be just west of Bellevue. I mean, the Vermilion ran east farther at that time. Yeah. And it's down in that grove of trees south of 24 Highway. They found it in that spring. The Pawnee had burnt that Kansa village in 42. And so they shot a black bear there, and then they headed northwest up through the hills. And the only entry he had in there for this area was the large abundance of hard red rock. And they go, "Yeah, that's us." So, but anyhow, they traveled on northwest, and he would have went right by the site of the Benton commune up there south of Frankfort. And so the irony of this is it's called the Benton commune because one of the founders of the commune was Thomas Hart Benton, third generation artist's daughter. And so he painted a picture for her to sell so they could buy that farm, and they moved there from Martha's Vineyard. And so I think that's kind of a weird coincidence. And ironically, that commune owns the largest construction firm in Southern California. They built Will Smith's mansion. They built Steven Spielberg's $50 million mansion. That's, yeah, I'm rambling, sorry. I finally get to the story. So, about the time Debbie called me, I got fascinated with this book. I check out books to listen to when I'm traveling and farming and stuff. And I checked it out with no high hopes because I thought it would be some malarkey. This guy did the most magnificent job of tying all the history together of the cattle drive days of Kansas and the gunfighters and stuff. He done fantastic. And the rest of my story is mostly plagiarizing from him completely. And so anyhow, the main character in this whole circle of things is going to be Bat Masterson. Now, I thought that I've always known there was a Bat Masterson out there. I never paid much attention to him. He was a real deal. And he was born in Canada, but he was raised on a farm northeast of Wichita. And literally, it said 13 miles northeast of Wichita. Well, Wichita right then was on the west side of the river, across from the Coliseum there. And so, raised on a farm northeast of Wichita, escaped the farm when he was 18 and got buffalo, soon worked his way up to being a shooter. The land graded for the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe, building west. Battle of the Adobe Walls, I'll talk about in a little bit. Sweetwater shooting, I'll talk about in a little bit. He was only a Dodge City lawman for 3 years. I mean, the heyday of Dodge City, the Wild West, was only about 5 years. And by the time he left, there were merchants in town hiring Texans to come up and kill the lawmen. I mean, they left when it was time to leave. And so, Ogallala incident, I'll get to all these in a little bit. And so I put this picture in here because this is a tour we hosted a couple of months ago at Donn Pearson McClish's farm, northeast of Wichita. And I figured that I had to be standing right about 3 miles from either way of where the Masterson farm was. And so it's right there somewhere. And so all Bat Masterson's parents and all of his siblings but Ed are buried in cemetery just south of that farm. I mean, it's that close. And they were a real tight family. I mean, he went back and visited all the time, and when Ed got killed, it really broke him up and all that kind of stuff. But it would be so cool if I had some free time to go down to the Register of Deeds and figure out which place was the Masterson place, because Bat Masterson's dad lived into his 90s. He died at 21, and his son farmed after that. I mean, there's history there that should be trackable. It'd be so cool to go knock on somebody's house in town and say, "Do you know Bat Masterson was raised here?"
Are they not aware of that? Would their county historical society have that?
Maybe. I don't know. I'm not tied to them, but
Yeah.
you would think they should be. Yeah. He is hated farming.
We were just at White Earp's grave in California. It's just south of San Francisco.
Yeah.
In the same cemetery as Levi Strauss.
Yep.
So I thought that was very interesting.
Yep. So the Battle of Adobe Walls. So he's out doing buffalo, 1870, 71, 2, where Dodge City eventually becomes. It's called Buffalo City at that time. And by 1874, the buffalo are running out. They ain't got hardly anybody to shoot anymore. The merchants in town are all worried about what's going to happen with the current upcoming hunting season. And so the merchants talk a group of buffalo hunters into going down into the Texas Panhandle and intercepting the buffalo on their migration north early. And so 28 buffalo hunters agreed to do that. And if the Adobe Walls would be like northeast of Pampa, Texas, northeast of Amarillo. And this was done completely breaking the Treaty of Medicine Lodge Treaty. I mean, they knowingly broke the treaty to go into Indian territory to do this. And they built some buildings, a couple of merchants set up a couple of buildings. And anyhow, the leader of the 700 Indians that attacked them was Quanah Parker. And so 700 Comanches attacked 28 buffalo hunters holed up in here. And according to Bat Masterson's account and others, Bat Masterson was one of the 28, this 20-year-old kid. And he said that, you know, it got down to hand and gun barrels right up against their bellies. But here's these two buildings full of buffalo hunters with 50 caliber Sharps rifles and a whole building full of ammunition to shoot buffalo. And these 700 Indians just got the shit shoe out of them. And so they finally back off, and they're trying to figure out what to do. And Quanah Parker's sitting on his horse a half a mile away. And one of the buffalo hunters shoots him off his horse from a half mile. And so it shot him in the arm. So then they backed off farther, and the medicine man that told them they couldn't be harmed and this would be a safe attack to do was sitting on his horse almost 3/4 of a mile away. And Tom Dixon shot him off his horse at 1,500 yards. They stepped it off afterwards with that Sharps buffalo rifle. After that, they decided maybe they ought to give up the hunt. And anyhow, so that was an incident in Bat Masterson's life. I mean, this is a real deal. Beginning of the West, as we knew it in cowboy time. Quanah Parker was half white. His mom was a captured white woman. He became a really wealthy rancher in Oklahoma afterwards. He built the Star Home, which is on the historic register down there, and it's on my bucket list to tour. Rode in a car with Theodore Roosevelt's inaugural parade along with Geronimo and Bat Masterson. And so here the two guys are trying to kill each other decades earlier. So this is Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson as deputies in 1876. Charlie Bassett was a sheriff that hired him. He was really the first lawman that Dodge City took seriously to start taming the town. And he's not talked about much, but he's pretty important in that whole thing. So Bat Masterson, this claims this picture was in 1876. In January of 1876, Bat Masterson was in Sweetwater, Texas, but not the Sweetwater, Texas, the Sweetwater, Texas now. When they tried to get a post office, they had to change the name because there already was a Sweetwater. So it's up in the panhandle of Texas, Moby P, Texas, Moby T. Anyhow, that was a wild town right then, and he was there. And Billy Thompson's wife, Squirrel Tooth Alice, had a bar and brothel there, and Bat Masterson was hot on one of her girls, and they were in there late at night, and one of those soldiers from the local fort, that's why there was a town there, they established a fort there to start taming that part of Texas. And one of the soldiers came in that was sweet on the same girl and drunk and started shooting and shot Bat Masterson in the groin and broke his pelvis. And so that's why you always hear Bat Masterson has a cane. He used a cane to walk for the rest of his life because of that shooting when he was 22. And but anyhow, the girlfriend then jumped in front of him and she got shot and killed by the drunken soldier. But then Bat Masterson killed the drunken soldier. So Bat Masterson's laying there severely wounded, and Billy Thompson's brother, Ben Thompson, jumps up on a table and holds back the rest of the soldiers that were going to finish off Bat Masterson. So he saved Bat's life till they could get people from the fort there to take care of the soldiers. So that's the Sweetwater incident. So that might be why he's leaning against that chair. I'd lean against it too. So just a second about Wyatt Earp. We all heard of Wyatt Earp. You know, basically his claim to fame was Dodge City and Yoke Corral, and that was about it, really. Bat Masterson learned art of buffaloing from his boss when he was a constable in Wichita, and basically that's before anything can happen, hit him over the head with a gun butt and taken to jail. Well, in the Donn City days, that came in real handy because there wasn't that much gunplay, and their salaries sucked, but they got $2 an arrest and went into jail each time. So buffaloing worked real good, but that's what Bat Masterson and Wyatt Earp were good at, and they were lifelong friends, close friends. Anyhow, later on, he was just trying to make a living, pretty well ran out of all his money. Him and his wife ran a brothel up in Nome, Alaska during that gold rush. Come back to Los Angeles area. Mostly made his living prospecting for gold and boxing referee. He was a nationally respected boxing referee. And so he'd do those gigs. Legend has it that he would do consulting to the movie studios for authenticity in their westerns. And that a young stagehand that hung around him all the time named Marion Morrison absorbed everything he had or tried to emulate him, and that became the actor John Wayne. So anyhow, that's him prospecting with his wife. The photo in the recliner was like a month before he passed. So, the doll knife incident. I was telling my friends from Topeka this the other night, and they had never heard this story. And I was surprised to run across it, but in 1879, Doll Knife tried to take part of his band of Indians back from the Oklahoma reservation territory to their Montana traditional grounds. And to do that, they went through Kansas, and that was that rampage of 1879. And so there were 89 warriors, 246 women and children. And Dodge City barricaded the town because it looked like they were coming right for Dodge City as they were traveling, and they were killing settlers and stealing things to survive and fighting off 1,000 soldiers chasing them. And so they bypassed Dodge City, but then they got cornered by Scott City, where Punished Woman's Canyon or Cave or something like that is there south of Scott Lake. They got cornered there, but then in the middle of the night they escaped up a side ravine and got away, finally got captured up in Nebraska. And so they were, the leaders of that was incarcerated in Leavenworth till they could figure out what to do with them. So it was finally decided that they should be tried in Dodge City because that's where most of the murders had happened in Kansas, and the most murders of the whole thing. And so Bat Masterson was charged with retrieving them from Leavenworth and getting them to Dodge City. And he took one of the Earp brothers and one of his brothers and that Charlie Bassett and another guy, and they go to Leavenworth and get those prisoners. And so they're on their way back, and they hit such a riot of a mob in Lawrence when the train stopped, they had to physically fight the rioters off the train to go again. They were trying to come in and lynch those Indians. And so then they got to Topeka, and there was a mob there so large it was over 1,000 people, and so violent they had to fight their way into the Shawnee County Jail where they all spent the night so they could survive. And so they got him on okay. They held him in Dodge City for 4 months, and then he was charged with taking him back to Lawrence for trial. So he took him back to Lawrence for trial, and they held him in Lawrence for 4 months, and then they turned him loose and never tried him. And so that's how that all worked. But I had no idea that Bat Masterson had to fight off mobs in Lawrence and Topeka to do this job. And if the book's lying, I found it on the internet too. So anyhow, I stayed with a good friend a few years back in Alaska, Don Brainerd, and he's originally from Oberlin. And he said, we were talking family heirlooms one night up in his home in Alaska, and he goes, well, I got something. And he goes, starts throwing shit out of a closet. In the very back of the closet, he pulls that out, and that's an 1865 cavalry saber. And he's originally from Oberlin, And the story with it is his great uncles were twin brothers, and they were young, and their dad sent them out on the prairie to collect buffalo chips for the fire, and they found that saber out on the prairie under the skeleton of a horse. And so that would have been the exact route that Don's band would have done in 1879, and this could very well be something from that experience through Kansas. But anyhow, that was the last thing I expected to see come out of that closet in Alaska. And that thing is heavy. You had to be a stud to handle one of them. So I bring up the John Sullivan Patty Ryan fight. It was a championship fight in 1882. And the reason I bring it up is because Pat Masterson went to it. He was a sportsman, especially boxing. And so he goes to Mississippi City in 1882 to that boxing match, and he runs into two friends. Anybody know who those two friends are?
Jesse and Frank.
Yep, Jesse and Frank James also went to the boxing match. And that boxing match was a month before Jesse James was shot by Ford. So that was a month before he was killed. This is taken in 1872, but they look like two teenage kids in that photo.
I think they had a hideout or a old house or something down here where they built Jeffrey, because I remember when they were building Jeffrey, somebody said that down their area. They had a,
Brown Ranch.
Yeah, on the Brown Ranch, yeah.
yeah.
Yep, I've heard that story.
Donn,
Yeah.
George Bennett, go to Jackson County, down F Road.
Yeah,
George Bennett was the first white man to settle in Jackson County, Kansas.
okay,
And he was a cousin of Frank and Jesse, and they would come up to visit. So
okay,
they spent time in this area.
cool. So, Richard, right here, yes, talks a lot if you get him started, but his ancestor rode with Contrail and rode with Frank and Jesse James band. Is that right? Okay.
Donn, my dad was born in 1899, and I had seen a Jesse James movie, and he was St. Joe, and I asked my dad, have you ever heard a Jesse James story? He said, well, yes. When he was a little boy, this really old man said he was sitting in his rocking chair at St. Clair, and they were headed west, a group of horsemen with dusters on, and he said, howdy, Frank, and the guy acknowledged, and they rode on west.
Right.
And I think they were headed to that place down by the Brown Ranch.
Yeah. Anyhow, this brings up my Donn picture. Probably everybody in the room's seen it already, but I guess you're stuck hearing it again. So this picture photograph was a postcard with writing on the back and a picture on the front. It was sent to my great-grandfather, Herman Teske, and it wasn't signed. But it just says a man with an X over the top of him in the middle is me. And he says the old man on the end with an X over the top of him is one of them James guys that used to rob people. And so that would have been Frank James if that's accurate. And that's all he did was get through life. I mean, he never went to prison. He surrendered his guns right after Jesse got shot. Used to do traveling shows with Cole Younger. People would come to the farm all the time, and they'd view Jesse James' grave, and they'd want to buy a rock from off of his grave, so he'd sell them a rock. And then when the rocks got used up, he'd bring more up from the creek and put more rocks on. And so, there's actually, I was looking at this when I put it together, and I look at this and I look back at that. There is a resemblance in that picture to the two photos. And Van Masterson and Frank James stayed friends up until Frank James died. They exchanged correspondence. So this is a famous Dodge City Peace Commission in 1883. And so what happened was everybody had moved on. Dodge City had changed and everybody had moved on. except Luke Short. Luke Short owned half of the Long Branch Saloon, and there was this one faction that didn't get along with the other faction in Dodge City, and it was the one faction that was hiring killers to go out and kill the lawmen and that kind of thing. And anyhow, one day they just loaded all the other faction up by gunpoint down to the train station and says, "We don't care which way you go, you just get on the train, you don't come back." And so at that time, Charlie Bassett was living in Kansas City, and Luke Short, this is Luke Short, so he gets on the train, goes to Kansas City, gets together with Charles Bassett, they start telegraphing all the old bunch, and they're all going to come back to Dodge City and straighten this shit out. And so Wyatt Earp comes in 2 days beforehand, and then the next day meets with the sheriff and says, you know, Bat Masterson will be on the noon train tomorrow, and after that we're fixing to light up the town. The other side just caved, so there was never a shot fired. But the next day then at Luke Short's bar, they had this group photo taken of a few of them that were there. There were like 30 of that gang or bunch that came in at that time and to help out Luke Short. And so this is a picture of a few of them, but that's the picture I see of Charlie Bassett. This is Wyatt Earp, and then Luke Short, and Bat Masterson. And so the other three, I mean, the names are in the Google or in the history books, but I didn't place them in my mind for anything. So that was just a posed photo after that non-event. That's the Long Branch Saloon at that time. So later on in life, from the 1880s through 1900, Bat Masterson was in Denver running sports betting and gambling parlors and stuff like that. But basically made a bunch of bad investments, was dead broke, didn't know what to do. His good friend Teddy Roosevelt talked him into coming to New York City. And so in 1902, him and his wife moved to New York City, and he became a sports writer for the Morning Telegraph and wrote 3 times a week for almost 20 years. And so President Roosevelt appointed him a deputy U.S. Marshal for the Southern New York District. That allowed him to carry a gun and also to have a salary. He offered him Oklahoma. Bat Masterson turned him down. He says, "I'm an old man now." He says, "I'm almost 50 years old." He says, "There'll be some kid that wants a reputation and will gun me down in Oklahoma." And he says, "I just didn't stay in New York City." And so that's what he did. He gave him to Southern New York City. And he died of a heart attack at his desk. I'm going to read his final column after all, because that's one reason why I like him so well. But one of the stories was that people would constantly ask him to sell them his coat as a collector's item. And he'd always tell them, "No, I need my coat, or it's my history," and blah, blah, blah. And they keep after him, and finally he'd sell him his coat. Then the next day he'd go down to the pawn shop and buy another Colt 45. And he'd carve the 20 notches in the handle. And there are a lot of Bat Masterson Colt 45s out there. Then there was another story that I thought was pretty cool. He was in one of the trendier restaurants in New York, and a couple of his problems from the old West days come to New York City to even the score. And they find him in that restaurant. And so he's a 60-year-old man, and the first one he decks down on the ground and knocks him out, and the second one he reaches in his pocket and rams in his belly and holds him there until the law can come. And he gets done, and he pulls out a pack of cigarettes. He held against his stomach the whole time. And so he never lost his wits or his pizzazz. He was well respected, everything I can read. This is a picture that's dated a month before he died. His wife, Emma, was first married to a veteran of the Civil War, and after the Civil War he became a professional runner, whatever the hell that means. I don't know what that means, but then she started doing that too, and they performed in shows, and then she got to doing Indian war clubs or whatever. But anyhow, at the time of their divorce, for them to get married, he was the coach of the University of Minnesota's football team. Times are getting more modern. And they were married for 30 years, never had any children. Maybe it had something to do with getting shot in the groin. I don't know. But this is his, parts of his final column. He wrote about the disparity between boxers making thousands of dollars per fight, while a hardworking farmer labors from daylight to dark for 40 of the best years of his life, and he's lucky if he finishes with as much as one of these birds gets in an hour. Yet though there are those who argue that everything breaks even in this old dump of a world of ours, he continued, I suppose these ginks who argue that way hold it because the rich man gets ice in the summer while the poor man gets ice in the winter. Things are breaking even for both. Maybe so, but I can't see it that way. I mean, how can you not respect a guy like that?
Pretty smart.
So now we move on. So we got Jess Willard, our local, born in St. Clair, blacksmith in Emmett. There was a cafe on Main Street in Onaga that stood him up against the wall once and made a line because he was so tall that marked on the side of the cafe for years. Fought for the title in Havana, Cuba, 67,000. But what I found out since I did this slide is that Bat Masterson was his second in Havana. And so he got in the ring with him and done the chair and the bucket and that kind of thing with Jess Willard. And I ran across this, if it works. Come on, baby. Come on, baby. Come on, baby.
Here are Johnson and Willard being introduced in Havana 1 week before the fight. Johnson appears a dapper world traveler compared to farm boy Willard in his Sunday best suit. The timekeeper for the upcoming fight takes a bow. It's none other than Bat Masterson, the fabled Western gunfighter and marshal. As you can see, he must have used the toupee for his TV appearance.
Obviously, they didn't have sound back then. This has been dubbed on later.
The morning of April 5th, Johnson, as usual, enters the ring first. At this time, Jack Johnson had not set foot in the United States in 3 years. Jess appears a fearsome figure dressed all in black. This is the man that an estimated 40 million Americans will be rooting for while getting telegraphed round-by-round accounts of the forthcoming battle. In 1915, the fighters were required to weigh in just before the fight. The scales confirmed the expected 60-pound difference between champion and challenger. Another old-time custom, putting the gloves on in the ring. On Johnson's right is Sam McVeigh, another all-time great Negro heavyweight. The two men shake hands for the cameras, and one of the most controversial encounters in boxing history is about to begin. This is a still photograph of the scene at Havana Racetrack as it appeared during the fight. Not until 1967 was the complete version of the actual fight films discovered. As you watch, see if you believe that one of these two men threw the fight. The first round. The fight starts calmly, both men aware that they may have to go 45 rounds in the sweltering tropical sun. Temperature at ringside, 103 degrees and rising. The bout was originally to be held in Mexico City, with Pancho Villa providing the money. Adverse developments in the Mexican Revolution forced the fight to be moved here to Cuba. Now see the fighters photographed by a special close-up camera. This is the first time film was taken from first row ringside. You can see a corner water bucket and a spectator's head in the foreground. Round 10 from a camera facing the grandstand. Johnson is showing the skeptics that he's still the best boxer in the world, scoring in flurries to gain a commanding point lead. But this fight is becoming an endurance contest, with conditioning the decisive factor. Johnson, in his 7th year as champion, second only to Sullivan in longevity, does not have time on his side.
That's $10 to win.
The 26th round. Already this is the longest fight ever held in the heavyweight division under Marquis of Queensberry rules. Willard is watching closely, realizing that his chance to reverse the momentum of the fight may come shortly. Suddenly, Jess lashes out with a ponderous right. Johnson goes down. Referee Jack Welch counts, but the champion doesn't move. 8, 9, 10. Jess Willard is the new heavyweight champion of the world, scoring a convincing 26th round knockout. The partisan crowd goes wild. They surround Willard.
Do you know why that fight wasn't in the United States?
Yeah, because the other guy was an outlaw. He was
Well,
wanted
he
in
was
the
a
United
black guy
States.
that liked white women.
Yeah.
And if he'd
yeah.
gone back to the States, he was going to be put in jail.
Yeah. So Barb has a scrapbook of Jess Willard she brought that the boy put together somewhere around here.
It's back here.
Yeah.
Ways of time.
Anyhow, my next character's Buffalo Bill, William F. Cody. 1854, family moved to Kansas Territory. What I read online claims it was near Leavenworth. What I always understood earlier was the farm was east of Holton. His dad got injured in Bleeding, Kansas, and died 3 years later from the wounds that he got from there finally. But in that time he actually managed to serve in the territorial legislature before he died. But Cody was 11 when he died, had to go work feeding a family, started out working for an uncle near Greenleaf, then he went on to do his other stuff. Pony Express rider, freight hauler, cavalry scout, all West. We all heard about Buffalo Bill. Well, my old landlord, Bill Burke, told me he thought Buffalo Bill was pretty full of himself. He claimed Buffalo Bill would stay with his dad there at the farm when he was delivering barb wire to the hardware store. I don't know why it wouldn't have came in by train, but that was Bill's story. It might have been a tall story. So he claimed he was at Bill Burke's funeral on Lookout Mountain, and I called bullshit on that one, and I think it was because I think Buffalo Bill died in 1917, and Bill didn't graduate high school till 1921. And Bill said that after he graduated high school, he just took off west, and he'd work his way west. He ran out of money, he'd stop to get a job, and work some more. And he was working for a ranch out in Rocky Mountains, and Buffalo Bill died, and that, you know, the rancher had to send his remuda over so all the bigwigs could ride horses to the top of Lookout Mountain for the funeral, and he got tasked with taking the horses there and being there during the funeral. And so I still say that was bullshit, but Buffalo Bill's wife died in 1921. Now, I think maybe he was there for Buffalo Bill's wife. Well, I don't know. It's a story. Anyhow, Scouts Rest, North Platte, Nebraska. If you've never been there, that's a destination thing. It's a state park. The barn is unbelievable, the horse barn. Buffalo Bill actually picked that spot on purpose because it's right on the main railroad line. But just north, and he's immediately in the Sand Hills. So all his Indian friends could come to visit without interacting with the white men. And so that's why he located his ranch where he located his ranch. So I'm getting into the local stories here. So now we got Billy Thompson, who had whose wife, Squirrel Tooth Alice, had the bar in Sweetwater where Pat Masterson got shot, and then Ben Thompson and the Top Hat, and then he was a lawman half the time, bar owner half the time. He saved Pat Masterson down there in Sweetwater. So Squirrel Tooth Alice was known for her pet prairie dogs, and so I zoomed up that picture. She's holding a prairie dog on her lap.
So how did she get the name Squirrel Tooth Alice?
She had a gap in her teeth, and she liked prairie dogs.
Okay.
They actually had 9 kids. I don't know. Billy was drunk all the time. I got more stories to talk about Billy, but Ben Thompson was usually just trying to get Billy out of trouble. They're both from England. Ben Thompson fought the Confederate Army, and then he fought for Maximilian. Abilene, Kansas, Bull's Head Saloon. So he set up a bar in Abilene during the time when Wild Bill Hickok was marshal for that whole 6 months. And he painted a huge painting of a bull on the front with a huge penis. And the townspeople were complaining about it. So Bat Masterson told him to take it down, and he wouldn't do it. So, not Bat Masterson,
Hickok.
Wild Bill Hickok told him to take it down, and he wouldn't do it. And so Wild Bill Hickok went and got a can of paint and did it himself. So that pissed off Ben Thompson, and he was trying to get Texans to kill Wild Bill Hickok, but then they cooled down. So then he moves over to Ellsworth and sets up shop. And that's Ellsworth, Kansas in 1867. And Ellsworth has done a magnificent job of laying out what was where during the cattle drive days. And so you see these figures like this. And that day I was driving on Southwest Kansas this summer, and I'm listening to this book, and it's talking about they had an incident in front of this one saloon, and then Billy Thompson was drunk, and it didn't turn into any shooting, but he was still holding the shotgun and had both triggers back, and he accidentally shot their good friend, the sheriff of Ellsworth, and killed him. And so I am driving through town as I'm listening to this, and I look over and I see this, and I go, whoa, I didn't know they had this. And I start walking through there, and that is Billy Thompson shooting the sheriff. And it's like, how surreal is that? You're sitting here listening to it in a book, and then there's where it happened on that spot. And if you're going through Ellsworth, that's worth, they've got them all over there down that drag. So now I'm back to the story I started out on. So we got Bat Masterson and Buffalo Bill and Billy Thompson and Ben Thompson. So Bat Masterson isn't the sheriff at this time, it's 1880, and Billy Thompson's in Ogallala, Nebraska, and he's drunk, and he gets in an argument with the bartender, and he ends up shooting his 2 fingers and a thumb off of the bartender. Well, then he leaves the saloon, and the bartender didn't much care for that, so he came out with a shotgun in his right hand and shot Billy in the back, and wounded him pretty badly, but not fatally. And Billy works his way back to the hotel, to his room. The cops post guard on there, and they're going to hang him when he can walk okay again. He gets somebody to telegraph his brother Ben that they're going to hang me as soon as I'm physically able to be hung. I didn't know you had to be physically able to be hung. And that they say if you come to town, they're going to hang you beside me. And so Ben Thompson telegraphs Bat Masterson and asked if he could help him out. Ben Thompson's the guy that saved his life a few years before that, and they're friends anyhow. And so Bat Masterson goes to Ogallala, and yeah, he found Billy. Billy's injured in his hotel bed. He's too injured to travel very well, and they have a sheriff has a guard at the door all the time. And so he goes and talks to the bartender that got shot and asks if he had removed the charges, and the bartender demanded such a price that that wasn't doable. So he's trying to figure out what to do, and as he's visiting around town, in a few days there's going to be a barn dance in town. And the sheriff is going to be there because he's the only fiddle player in town, so he knows that. And so the night of the dance, he goes and hangs out with the sheriff, the guard, watching Billy, and he's telling the guard how much that sucks that they can't be at the barn dance partying with everybody else. And the guard agrees with him, so he gets the bartender to send up a couple of drinks from the barn hotel. Well, that bartender he knew from Dodge City days, and he knew that he concocted a really good Mickey. And so Bat Masterson gave that guard a Mickey, and pretty soon he was fast asleep. And Bat had timed that just right for when the midnight train would be coming into Ogallala. And he knew that if they headed south, they'd get caught because they couldn't travel fast. And he'd get home too because he wasn't a sheriff. And so he's hoping that he can head east, and his friend Buffalo Bill will be at home and not out on the road, and it'll help him. And so he times it so the guard falls asleep just when the train's coming in. He gets Billy across the street and onto the train, and they end up in North Platte, Nebraska at 2 o'clock at night. There's one bar open in town, and inside is Buffalo Bill telling stories to a group around him. And so Buffalo Bill is very happy to help him out, and they were head out in comfort for several days until there was Buffalo Bill was taking a party of 20 Europeans and General Tecumseh Sherman on a hunt. And so in a few days, and so he decided that Bat and Billy would go with that hunt till it was safe for them to travel alone, because they were going south. And so he had just bought his wife a brand new buggy, and so he gave Bat that buggy and a horse to drive to Dodge City. And so they go out with the party, and how it's worded is they took an ocean of alcohol along to smooth the bumps and stopped repeatedly to replenish themselves. And at one point, Buffalo Bill got so intoxicated he couldn't ride his horse, so he crawled in the back of the mess wagon and passed out. And so they go a little farther, and the whole mess wagon tips over in a ravine, and Buffalo Bill's underneath the whole wagon, and they finally dig him out, and he ain't injured a bit. Still asleep. And so, anyhow, they get far enough south, and then they take off on their own, and he says by the time they got to Dodge City, through all the storms and rain, that the buggy was ready to fall into 100 pieces. And Buffalo Bill told him later on that he bought his wife a much nicer wagon to make up for it. So that was the Ogallala incident. And this is a pretty cool picture of that time, and I'm pretty sure that that's a hotel that Billy was in. And then here's the depot. And so he had to get Billy across the street to the depot and on the train and get out of town.
I wonder where the dance was.
Yeah,
Yeah,
touche.
Back this way.
yeah.
Okay, Ben Holiday, don't need to talk much about him, but he was based in western Missouri, started the Overland Stage Line. He was known for the reputation of the company being on time, started the Cormac Distillery in Weston, and still going now. They claim it's the longest continuous running distillery in America, blah, blah, blah. I drink some of their whiskey. Anyhow, the Overland Stage Line was eventually sold to Wells Fargo. He became a railroad robber baron in Pacific Northwest later on. But Weston Nebraska. I talked a little bit about Wild Bill Hickok. I just brought this slide up because he shot his first man at Rock Creek Station in Nebraska, and he was a stagehand there on the stage line. And so that's like 25 miles north of Washington. And it's a state park, and it's something to actually go see. So that's that close to us. He was almost totally blind when he died. Didn't get any more gunfights after he shot his deputy. So, we get into all this, and I got to reflecting on all of these Old West gunfighters, and none of them died violently. All of these died from physical causes. Now, you know, Luke Short died when he was 39 of kidney failure. That probably could be attributed to lifestyle, which I'm kind of guilty of, but he died in Gouda Springs, Kansas, which is southeast of Wichita, because it had a Miracle Springs there that he was hoping could cure him. Much like Doc Holliday with his tuberculosis and dying at Grand Junction, he was at Miracle Springs to try and buy some more time. Charlie Bassett died in his 40s of rheumatism. Buffalo Bill died an old man. Bat Masterson died at 68. Wyatt Earp at 80. Ham Bell, I haven't talked about him all night. So he was actually one of the Wyatt Earp, Bat Masterson, Dodge City. But he stayed on and became a leading city figure to build Dodge City into modern Dodge City. He had the first automobile dealership in Dodge City. He had brought in the first automobile ambulance, brought in the first automobile hearse, a lot of businesses around town, served as mayor. When he was 93 years old, he was running a pet shop in Dodge City. And, you know, he never killed anybody, and it says nobody ever shot back at him, but the reason they didn't was he was so fast that he'd have the gun out pointing at them before they could draw leather. And that kind of stopped him from shooting. And he says, if I wouldn't have drawn my gun back then, I wouldn't have lasted a week. And I think that's it. Did I go 2 hours again?
They certainly did a lot to die that young, some of them. I mean, they did a lot.
Oh, yeah.
A short time.
They packed a lot of life in a few years.
Bill Terman first got hired on as a deputy at Dodge City from the farm, and so he comes into town, and there's Luke Short walking down the street, in the middle of the street, and people are shooting him in the head. And like 5 or 6 times, and he just keeps walking, and they can't figure out what's going on. He gets to the end of the street, and he goes, "Ha ha, I told you boys you couldn't shoot the hat off my head." Yeah, but
You said Dodge City had changed its name. It was
Buffalo City.
Buffalo City. I often wondered if they didn't call it Dodge City because it was a city you want to dodge.
Yeah. There's a lot of speculation about that. There were 2 different commanders at Fort Dodge that were named Dodge, and I mean Dodge City evolved around Fort Dodge. And, yeah, but yeah, there was one story in that book I plagiarized that said there was a preacher and a following that were traveling west, and they, you know, he got to outside of Dodge City, and we, thank you Lord, we survived Indians and hail and storms and fire, and now we have to survive Dodge City.
They were pretty tough.
But that was only like 10 years. I mean, that was all this history we all are fascinated about in the movies. It's like 10 years before the railroads got down to Texas.
Those guys on the cattle drives, they were pretty tough people.
Yeah.
Think all the traveling they did, everything was like 2 days in the car if it did something.
Yeah.
They went all over the country, like versus outdoors.
It's pretty
Well,
tough.
Don, when I was in Ireland, one of the tour guides said 2 different stories about this one castle, and he said, but the Irish don't let the truth get in the way of a good story.
That's right. There you go.
So, whatever the story is.
I'm tickled the mobile hotspot worked. I just think that video is neater than heck. I ran across that and went, holy
Yeah,
cow.
that was a good deal. I mean, those was major figures back in the,
If you go find that online, I mean, it went a couple minutes more. It was like 5 minutes.
but,
And I think when he gets the shit beat out of him is also on there.
Yeah, it's online, it's horrible. And do you know that there is, the Willard Dempsey fight is mentioned in an I Love Lucy episode?
Yeah, there
Do
you
you guys
go.
know that? Lucy
I
buys
saw
some new
that.
furniture and Desi goes nuts and Ethel comes in and says, this is gonna be bigger than the Dempsey Willard fight.
There you go.
We're sitting there and we're like, where's Jim Willard? And so, yeah.
I was reading that book last night.
Too.
One
Yeah,
when they
yeah.
claimed that Dempsey had
Plaster.
plaster in his boxing gloves, and I was reading like,
Cause he is.
Well, I'm going to thank Dawn, and you're sure welcome to mingle, but it's a little warm here. We do have refreshments in the back, but a couple of things. Let's give Dawn a big round of applause for all that. Back when our sons were playing baseball, one of our sons would usually go, well, off and on would go with Dawn in their car. And he always made the comment, I wonder where we're going to go after the game is at. They always went somewhere to explore.
And one night, we had come back from a K-State game, and we stopped at the Louis View Cemetery. And I was filling them full of that stuff, and that was the night it got vandalized. And so I was there at dark. So I called the sheriff the next morning when I see it on the news and go, I was there at dark and it was fine then and it wasn't me.
Have you ever had a chance to visit with Jimmy Tessendorf about the Louis View thing? Because he's got a lot of information about that.
I haven't, and there's a lot known about him.
Yeah.
He's just, he's a figure in our local history.
He's got a lot of.
Well, I like the candle for a special reason. We have somebody here today that has a birthday. And I refuse to buy birthday candles in our home, so we have this giant birthday candle that will burn for 100 years. So, let us sing happy birthday to Diane. On the count of 3, everybody go 1, 2, 3. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Diane. Happy birthday to you.
And many more.
Are you gonna blow the candle out? You want to keep the candle burning? My kids would be really glad if we kept it burning.
Thank you.
I think that Larry and Diane have been putting a lot of time in up here on our different building projects that we have. Seems like everything here needs a little bit of tender loving care, in addition to us trying to put up a new building. There is a can in the back if you feel like giving a donation to the building fund. It is under a match right now, the donations. If you are a person who's donated before and you want to write a check, that way we can add it to your cumulative amount that you have donated, if you feel like that. Otherwise, we have refreshments in the back. We have a real treat. We have a cake left over from yesterday. And we have some cookies left over from yesterday. And then Rosie called and volunteered to bring her no-bake cookies. So there's no-bake cookies back there too. So with that, you probably need to get up and move a little bit. And there's the fresh refreshments on the table in the back. And then there's the lemonade. And then there's a can if you feel so inclined to give a donation. We do have these 2 books. We have plenty of these in our museum. We don't need these extra ones, so if anybody wants these books, just let me know and you can have those, or just take them off the table. So, thank you very much, Don. We'll look forward to the next edition
You have to
of
come up with
Don.
a topic.
Anybody have a topic you want him to research? Think about it. If you do, let him know, because he will put together that topic and have a delightful presentation. So, thank you all for coming. Maybe the next time we gather in this big event, this many people in one space will be in our new building. But
You might tell them.
We might not be there either.
You might tell them the weather thing was rescheduled.
For those of you that were interested in the meteorologist coming, Doug Myers, it would have been it'd been really neat to have had him here that day. And have him tell us it's going to be okay. But he did get to Rossville and chose to turn around and go back to Topeka, and he said, "You all should be home." And of course, as we were getting ready to leave, who should drive up but Neva Dean and Reva? And for those of you that don't know those two ladies, they're in their 90s. So I did leave here pretty efficiently after that and got caught really in the blunt and the storm moving in just as I was going across the bridge west of
Did you
town.
watch some of the newscasts on that night? Jeremy, I'm assuming, during COVID, he had all his stuff down in the basement, and he broadcast from there. Well, he was on the air, and all of a sudden I heard this little voice say, "But he's slobbering on the couch." Jeremy said, "But he's slobbering on the couch." And he said, "Just sit down, I'll be with you." And I thought, I bet he's in the basement and he's got kids. And the next thing you knew, the little boy ran across in front of the camera and he says, "Stay out of front of the camera." Okay.
So not Jeremy, but Doug Myers will be here August the 8th.
Oh, okay.
It's a Tuesday. It was tricky finding a time.
Yeah.
He's on different conferences and things, finding a time for him to come. It'll be at 2 in the afternoon, and the plan is to have it here. If we think it's going to be a bigger crowd than all of you, it might be we'll move it to the senior center, but there is a charge for us to use the senior center. So anyway.
Can you use this